High Commander Zerethnos stood at the bridge of his flagship and watched the blue planet grow larger in the viewing screen before him. 100 years of preparation had led to this moment, and he felt nothing but cold satisfaction as he observed the primitive world spinning slowly in the darkness of space. The humans had no idea what was coming for them. Behind his vessel stretched a fleet of 100,000 warships, each one cloaked by phase shift technology that made them invisible to every sensor known to exist in the galaxy. The Vethkai Dominion had conquered 47 species using this same approach, and not once had they failed. Their technology was perfect, and their methods were proven beyond any doubt. Status report. Zerethnos commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. His second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Kethro, stepped forward with a slight bow of respect. All vessels are in position. High Commander, and the binding web confirms full synchronization across the entire fleet. The binding web was the crown jewel of Vethkai engineering, and it represented centuries of technological advancement compressed into one seamless system. Every ship, every weapon, every piece of equipment in the Dominion's military was connected through this quantum network. Commands flowed through it at speeds that made light seem slow, and the coordination it provided was absolutely flawless. No enemy had ever found a way to disrupt it, because the mathematics behind it were simply too complex for lesser minds to comprehend. The Vethkai had tested it against the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and none had even come close to understanding how it worked. And one of their defenses, Zerethnos asked as he studied the planet below Cathral, made a sound that passed for laughter among his species, primitive beyond description. High Commander, as they rely on chemical propulsion rockets and simple nuclear weapons, and their orbital platforms are held together with metal bolts and optimistic engineering. Their communication networks, unsecured and unencrypted by our standards. And we have already infiltrated every major military channel on the planet. Zerethnos allowed himself a thin smile, as this was going to be even easier than he had anticipated. The humans were a young species who had barely taken their first steps into space, and they had no idea that the galaxy was filled with predators far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. In a few hours, they would learn the truth, and by then it would be far too late for them to do anything about it. 12,000 light years away, the Dominion's Council was already preparing the occupation plans, and the humans would make excellent laborers. Once their spirit had been properly broken, it was the same story that had played out 47 times before. And Zerethnos saw no reason why the 48th would be any different. On the surface of the planet, in a small observatory nestled among the green hills of New Zealand, Dr. Alara Chun was having a very strange night. She had been running routine background radiation measurements when something caught her attention and made her lean closer to her equipment with a frown on her face. There was a pattern in the data that should not exist. At first she thought her instruments were malfunctioning, because what she was seeing made no scientific sense at all. The background radiation of space was supposed to be random and uniform, with only minor variations caused by distant cosmic events, but what she was looking at was anything but random. There was a rhythm to it, a structure that repeated in ways that natural phenomena simply did not. Alara had spent 15 years working as a cryptographer for the military before she retired to pursue her own research, and her brain was trained to recognize patterns that others would miss. This was definitely a pattern, and it was definitely not natural. She ran the data through her analysis software 3 times, just to make sure she was not imagining things, and each time the result came back the same. Something out there was communicating using quantum frequencies that humanity had only theorized about, and whatever it was seemed completely unaware that anyone might be listening. "Where are you?" Alara whispered to herself as she stared at the scrolling numbers on her screen. She had no way of knowing that she had just detected the communication bleed from the most advanced military network in the galaxy, and she had no way of knowing that the Vethkai scientists had sworn such detection was mathematically impossible. All she knew was that something very strange was happening in the space around Earth, and her instincts told her that she needed to understand what it was before it was too late. She began recording every piece of data she could capture and storing it on drives that she disconnected from any network. If this was what she thought it might be, then she wanted to make sure she had evidence that could not be erased or corrupted. The hours passed as she worked through the night, and her coffee grew cold beside her keyboard as she forgot to drink it by the time the sun began to rise over the hills of New Zealand. She had accumulated months' worth of data compressed into a few gigabytes of carefully organized files. She did not understand what she was looking at yet, but she knew it was important. As the first rays of sunlight touched her observatory windows, something changed in the readings. The pattern shifted and intensified as though whatever was generating it had suddenly become more active. Elora felt a chill run down her spine as she watched the data spike to levels she had never seen before. High above the Earth, the Vethkai fleet began to decloak, and 100,000 warships appeared in the sky like demons emerging from the darkness between stars. The invasion had begun across the planet. Billions of humans looked up at the sky and saw something that shattered everything they thought they knew about their place in the universe. Military bases scrambled to respond, and governments convened emergency sessions, and scientists stared at their instruments in disbelief. But in her small observatory, Alara Chun did not look up at the sky because she was too busy staring at her data and realizing that she had been watching these invaders prepare for weeks without understanding what she was seeing. Now she understood, and now she knew that the strange quantum signal she had detected was the key to something far larger than she had ever imagined. She just had to figure out how to use it before humanity ran out of time. The message came through every screen and every speaker and every communication device on Earth at exactly the same moment. It was broadcast in every human language with perfect pronunciation, and its meaning was absolutely clear. People of Earth, you are now subjects of the Vethkai dominion, and your world belongs to us. So you will surrender unconditionally within 1 hour, or we will reduce your civilization to ash and your species to extinction. The voice belonged to High Commander Zerithnos, and he spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had delivered this same ultimatum to 47 other worlds. He knew exactly how this would unfold because it always followed the same pattern. First came the denial, and then the anger, and then the desperate military response, and then the realization that resistance was futile, and finally the desperate military response, and then the realization that resistance was futile, and finally the desperate military response, and then the realization that resistance was futile. Surrender. The Vethkai had refined this process over centuries, and they had it down to a science. What they did not expect was how quickly the humans skipped past denial and moved straight to violence within minutes of the ultimatum. Nuclear missiles were launching from silos across every continent, and orbital defense platforms were spinning up weapons that humanity had never admitted to building. Fighter jets scrambled from aircraft carriers, and directed energy weapons fired from secret installations hidden in mountains and deserts. The response was chaotic and uncoordinated, and absolutely furious. On the bridge of his flagship, Zerithnos watched the human counterattack with something approaching amusement. They are certainly enthusiastic, he remarked to Kethral, who stood beside him monitoring the tactical displays. Their aggression is noted, Kethral replied, but it will make no difference against the binding web. He was right. The quantum network that connected every Vethkai ship processed the incoming attacks with perfect efficiency and coordinated the defense of the fleet with mathematical precision. Nuclear missiles were tracked from the moment they launched, and gravity wells caught them and redirected them into each other, where they detonated harmlessly in brilliant flashes of wasted energy-directed energy weapons, were analyzed in microseconds, and their frequencies were matched and reflected back toward their sources, orbital platforms that fired them. Exploded one by one as they were destroyed by their own weapons. Kinetic impactors, launched from hidden moonbases, were caught in miniature black holes and crushed into spheres of compressed metal smaller than a human fist, nothing the humans threw. The fleet even came close to causing damage in the first hour of the battle. Earth lost 60% of its nuclear arsenal and 40% of its orbital infrastructure. By the 6th hour, those numbers had climbed to 85% and 70%. By the 12th hour, humanity's military capability had been reduced by 94%, and the remaining forces were scattered and disorganized, and utterly demoralized world leaders began quietly reaching out to diplomatic channels to discuss terms of surrender. The Vethkai had won, and everyone knew it. Everyone except Alara Chen. She had not watched the battle unfold because she had been too busy working in the basement of her observatory, surrounded by equipment. She had been modifying for hours the quantum signal she had detected before the invasion was still there, still pulsing through space with its strange rhythmic pattern, and now that she could see it alongside the tactical data being broadcast by panicking military channels, she was beginning to understand what she was looking at. The binding web was not just a communication system. It was a language, a complete and structured language with grammar and syntax and rules that governed how information flowed through. Itelera had spent 15 years breaking codes and encryptions that governments swore were unbreakable, and she had done it by understanding one simple truth. Every system created by intelligent beings carried the fingerprints of how those beings thought. The Vethkai had built their perfect network based on their own assumptions about logic and order and security. They had never imagined that someone might simply learn to speak their language instead of trying to break it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she documented everything she was discovering. The patterns were complex, but they were not random, and the more she studied them, the more they revealed about how the binding web operated. She needed help, and she needed resources, and most importantly, she needed access to actual Vethkai technology to test her theories. She knew exactly who to call. Colonel Marcus Webb was coordinating what remained of human resistance from a bunker deep in the Rocky Mountains. He was exhausted and angry, and watching his species lose a war that had lasted less than a day when his secure terminal beeped with an incoming message from a priority channel. He almost ignored it. Then he saw the sender identification, and he felt a spark of something he had not felt in how Shopilar Chun had been the best cryptographer he had ever worked with, and if she was reaching out now, then she had found something important. He opened the message and read it 3 times before responding. Her proposal was insane and probably impossible and almost certainly suicidal, but it was also the only plan anyone had offered that did not involve surrender or extinction. He thought about the reports coming in from around the world about cities being occupied and populations being herded into containment zones and soldiers being executed for refusing to lay down their weapons. Then he thought about his children who were hiding in a shelter somewhere in Montana, waiting for their father to save the world. He typed his response and sent it before he could change his Mindalara would get her chance, and she would get the resources she needed. And if her crazy theory was right, then maybe humanity still had a chance. If she was wrong, then they were all dead. Anyway, at least this way they would go down fighting. The military transport touched down on the Antarctic ice sheet in the middle of a howling blizzard that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Alara Chun climbed out of the aircraft with her equipment bags clutched against her chest and immediately felt the cold bite through her thermal suit like it was made of paper. A soldier in white camouflage appeared from the swirling snow and gestured for her to follow. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes until they reached a prefabricated structure half buried in a snowdrift inside. She found warmth and light and a small team of scientists and soldiers who looked at her with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism in equal measure. "Dr. Chun," said a tall woman in a military uniform who stepped forward to shake her hand. "I am Captain Sarah Rodriguez and I command this facility, so welcome to the end of the world. Show me the ship." Elara replied without wasting time on pleasantries. Captain Rodriguez led her through a series of corridors until they reached a massive chamber that had been carved out of the ice itself. In the center of the space sat the crashed Vethkai scout vessel. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, with smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ship had come down 3 days before the main invasion fleet arrived, and the Vethkai had apparently written it off as lost rather than risk exposing their presence by attempting a rescue. That decision might prove to be their greatest mistake. Elara walked around the vessel slowly, studying every detail while her mind raced through possibilities and calculations. The outer hull was damaged, but the internal systems still showed signs of power, and that meant the ship was still connected to the binding web. "Have you been able to access any of its systems?" she asked, without looking away from the alien craft. Captain Rodriguez shook her head. "Our best hackers have been working on it since we found it, but they cannot even identify where the access points are, let alone break through the encryption." Elara smiled for the first time since the invasion began. "That is because they are trying to break in," she said, "but I am going to walk through the front door." Over the next 12 hours, she worked without rest, connecting her equipment to the alien ship through interfaces she designed on the spot using theories she was developing in real time. The other scientists watched her with a mixture of awe and confusion as she muttered to herself in a language that mixed mathematics and cryptography and something that sounded almost like poetry. She was not trying to hack the binding web, because hacking would trigger alarms and countermeasures that would shut her out instantly. Instead, she was teaching herself to speak its language so perfectly that the network would accept her as one of its own. The quantum patterns she had recorded before the invasion were the key, and they showed her the grammar rules that governed how information moved through the system. Every message had a specific structure, and every node had a specific signature, and every interaction followed a specific protocol. If she could replicate those patterns exactly, then the binding web would have no way to distinguish her from a legitimate Vethkai system. The problem was that doing this required more than just sending the right signals. The binding web operated on a quantum level, which meant that to truly become part of it, she would need to entangle her own neural patterns with its quantum substrate. In simple terms, she would need to put her brain directly into the alien network. The procedure she was designing had never been attempted by anyone in human history, and the chances of it killing her outright were significant. Even if she survived the initial connection, her consciousness would be stretched across 2 realities at once, and the strain might shatter her mind completely. She explained this to Captain Rodriguez, who listened with growing horror. "You are telling me that your plan requires you to literally merge your brain with an alien computer system that we do not understand?" "Yes, and you think this will work because you spent a few weeks listening to their radio signals?" "Yes, and if it fails, you will either die or go insane." "Also yes." Captain Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. "Colonel Webb said you were brilliant, but he did not mention that you were completely crazy." Elara shrugged. "In my experience, those two things often go together." She finished her preparations as the clock ticked toward the 48-hour deadline that Colonel Webb had given her. The interface she had built looked crude compared to the elegant Vethkai technology, but it would serve its purpose. A helmet covered in wires and sensors connected to the alien ship through cables that pulsed with strange light. When she put it on, she would either become the first human to enter an alien quantum network, or she would become another casualty. In a war that humanity was losing, the choice was not difficult. She thought about her parents, who had raised her to believe that intelligence was meant to be used in service of something greater than herself. She thought about her colleagues at the university who had always said she was too stubborn for her own good. She thought about the billions of people on Earth who were counting on someone to save them, even if they did not know her name. Then she put on the helmet and activated the interface. The last thing she heard before her consciousness exploded into a million fragments was Captain Rodriguez shouting her name. And then there was only light and mathematics and the vast infinite architecture of the binding web stretching out before her. Like a universe made of pure information, she had made it inside. Now, she just had to survive long enough to destroy everything the Vothkai had built. For 72 hours, Alara Chun existed in two places at once. Body lay motionless on a medical bed in the Antarctic facility, with monitors tracking her vital signs and doctors watching nervously for any indication that she was dying. Her consciousness floated through the binding web like a ghost made of mathematics and willpower. Experience was unlike anything she had ever imagined, and words failed to capture even a fraction of what she was perceiving. The network stretched around her in every direction. An infinite landscape of data streams and command pathways and processing nodes that pulsed with energy beyond human comprehension. She could sense the entire Vothkai fleet as individual points of light scattered across the darkness, and each ship was connected to every other ship through threads of quantum entanglement that formed a web of impossible complexity. At first she simply observed, afraid that any action might reveal her presence and trigger the defensive systems that protected the network. But as hours passed, she began to understand that her disguise was working perfectly. The binding web recognized her as a valid node because she had followed its rules exactly. She spoke its language without accent or error, and she presented credentials that she had reverse engineered from the signals she had captured before the invasion to the Vothkai systems. She was simply another piece of equipment, another thread in their perfect tapestry of control. They had no concept of what she actually was, because they had never imagined that anyone could learn their language well enough to fool them. This arrogance would be their downfall. Alara began to explore more boldly, moving through the network like a curious child wandering through a vast and ancient library. She discovered that the binding web controlled everything in the Vothkai military navigation. Systems received their coordinates through the network, and weapon systems waited for firing commands that flowed through the network, and life support systems maintained their settings based on instructions from the network. Even the food replicators on individual ships depended on the binding web to tell them what to produce. It was an engineering marvel, and also a catastrophic vulnerability that the Vothkai had never recognized. They were so proud of their perfect synchronization that they had made every system dependent on Ida truly resilient. Network would have been distributed with redundant pathways and independent nodes that could function even if the central system failed. But the Vothkai valued control above all else, and their network reflected that priority. Every command flowed through a central processor on the flagship, and every response returned to that same processor for verification. If someone could reach that central core and corrupt it, then the entire fleet would be affected simultaneously. Smiled with a consciousness that no longer had lips. She had found her target. The journey to the core was dangerous, because the closer she got to the flagship, the more scrutiny the network applied to her credentials. She had to modify her disguise constantly, adapting to new security protocols and learning new verification procedures on the flightwise. She nearly triggered alarms and had to retreat into quieter regions of the network until the attention passed. But she was patient, and she was clever, and she was driven by the knowledge that billions of lives depended on her success. On the bridge of the eternal silence, High Commander Zerethnos noticed something that disturbed him for reasons he could not explain. There were glitches appearing in His displays. Tiny delays in communication that lasted only fractions of a second but seemed wrong somehow. Catherall, he called to his second-in-command. Are you detecting any anomalies in the binding web? Catherall checked his instruments and shook his head. Nothing significant. Aye, Commander. Just minor fluctuations caused by solar interference from the system's young star. Run a full diagnostic anyway. Of course. Aye, Commander. The diagnostic found nothing because Alara had learned to hide her tracks with the same perfection she used to hide her presence. She was in the core now, swimming through the deepest levels of the binding web where the most critical commands were processed and distributed. She could see everything from here. The fleet disposition stretched out before her like a map of glowing points. The weapon systems hummed with barely contained power waiting to be unleashed. The occupation plans for Earth scrolled past in clinical detail, describing how the human population would be divided and distributed. Across Dominion space, she saw projections for how many humans would survive the initial processing, and how many would die from the stress of transport, and how many would eventually be bred in captivity to maintain the labor force. The coldness of it shocked her, even though she had expected nothing less. To the Vethkai, humans were not people, but resources to be managed and exploited. They would never negotiate in good faith, and they would never show mercy, and they would never leave Earth alone. There was only one way this could end. Alara began to make changes to the core programming. Subtle alterations that would not take effect until she triggered them. She worked slowly and carefully, testing each modification to make sure it would do what she intended. The binding web was complex, but it was also logical, and she had spent her entire career finding the logic in complex systems. By the time she was finished, she had planted instructions throughout the core that would transform the Vethkai's greatest weapon into their destruction. All she needed now was the signal to activate them. She sent a message through channels she had discovered during her exploration. A message that would reach kernel web through systems the Vethkai did not know had been compromised. It contained a single word and a timestamp. The word was ready, and the timestamp was 48 hours away. That would give the human resistance time to prepare for what was coming. Alara settled into the core of the binding web and waited as the hours counted down toward the moment when everything would change. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the command center of the resistance bunker and watched the clock on the wall count down to 0. Around him gathered the last organized military force on Earth, a ragged collection of soldiers from a dozen nations who had refused to accept defeat. They did not know if Alara was alive, and they did not know if her plan had worked, and they did not know if they were about to win a war or die in the final act of a futile resistance. All they knew was that she had sent a message saying she was ready, and now they were going to find out what that meant. The clock struck 0600 hours UTC. For a moment nothing happened, and Webb felt his heart sink as he imagined Alara dead or captured or simply wrong about everything. Then the sky exploded. High Commander Zerethnos was reviewing occupation reports when the first alarm sounded on the bridge of the eternal silence. He looked up in confusion as warning lights began flashing across every console and officers shouted reports that made no sense at all. The weapon systems are firing, but we have given no commands. Navigation is showing contradictory coordinates, and the ship is changing course without authorization. Shields are dropping across the fleet, and I cannot raise them again. The gravity wells are activating, but they are targeting our own vessels. Zerethnos surged to his feet and roared for silence. What is happening to the binding web? No one could answer him because no one understood the network that had never failed in 300 years of warfare was suddenly doing the opposite of everything it was told. Ships ordered to advance instead retreated at full speed. Weapons ordered to cease fire instead unleashed their full payload. Shields ordered to maximum instead collapsed completely, and through it all a voice spoke on every frequency in the fleet. A human voice speaking perfect Vethkai language. You built a perfect system, and you were so proud of it that you never imagined anyone might learn to speak its language. Zerethnos recognized the communication signature as coming from inside the binding web itself. That is the thing about humans that your intelligence reports never captured. We do not break your walls. We learn to walk through your doors. Find that signal and destroy it. Zerethnos commanded, but it was already too late. Alara had not just infiltrated the binding web. She had inverted it completely. Every command issued by Vethkai officers was received by the network and processed as its exact opposite. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity and devastating in their effect. Gravity wells meant to crush human ships instead turned inward and collapsed Vethkai cruisers into twisted metal gnarled disruptors designed to shut down human brains. Instead fired aboard their own vessels and dropped crews into unconsciousness navigation. Systems that should have coordinated fleet movements instead sent destroyers careening into battleships in catastrophic collisions. Binding web that had made the Vethkai invincible now made them helpless on Earth. The scattered human forces watched in disbelief as their alien conquerors turned on themselves. Occupation. Troops suddenly found their weapons refusing to fire and their vehicles refusing to move. The shields that had made Vethkai positions invulnerable flickered and died. Within an hour, the situation on the ground had reversed completely as human soldiers overwhelmed, confused, and helpless invaders in space. The destruction was even more complete. Fully half of the invasion fleet was destroyed in the first 30 minutes as ships collided and weapons misfired and engines overloaded. The survivors tried to flee, but their navigation system sent them in circles or directly into the path of debris escape pods launched only to have their life support system shut down moments later. High Commander Zerethnos watched his perfect invasion crumble into chaos and finally understood the truth that his species had never grasped. The Vethkai had believed that superior technology guaranteed victory. They had never considered that technology was only as strong as the assumptions it was built upon. They had assumed their language was too complex to learn, and their network was too sophisticated to infiltrate, and their security was too perfect to bypass. A single human with a telescope and a curious mind had proven every one of those assumptions wrong. Order the retreat, Zerethnos said quietly, his voice defeated. High Commander, the navigation systems are not responding to our commands. Then abandon the ships and use the escape pods that still function. Kethral hesitated. That will mean leaving behind our technology, and the humans will be able to study it. Zerethnos laughed bitterly. Let them study it because, clearly, they understand it better than we do. The surviving Vethkai fled in whatever vessels they could control. A pitiful remnant of the armada that had expected to conquer Earth in a single day, they carried with them the news of their defeat and the warning that would spread across the Dominion and eventually across the entire galaxy. Humanity was not to be underestimated. In the Antarctic facility, Alara Chun opened her eyes for the first time in nearly 4 days. Blood trickled from her nose and ears, and every nerve in her body screamed with exhaustion. But she was alive, and she was herself, and through the window of her medical room she could see people cheering and embracing as news of the victory spread. Captain Rodriguez appeared at her bedside with tears streaming down her face. You did it, she whispered. You actually did it. Alara tried to smile, but her muscles were too tired to cooperate. I just learned their language, she managed to say. Turns out they never expected anyone to bother trying. In the weeks that followed, humanity began the long process of rebuilding and recovering from the invasion. They studied the Vethkai technology that had been left behind and reverse-engineered what they could and destroyed what they could not understand. Binding web itself had collapsed when Alara withdrew from it, taking with it centuries of accumulated data and leaving behind only fragments. But those fragments were enough to launch humanity into a new era of technological advancement. Chun was celebrated as the savior of Earth, but she refused most of the honors and interviews and speaking requests that came her way. She returned to her observatory in New Zealand and went back to watching the stars with her instruments. But now she watched with different eyes, because she knew that the universe was full of species who thought they were superior to everyone else, and she knew that somewhere out there the Vethkai were rebuilding and remembering and probably planning their revenge. That was fine with her. If they came back, she would be ready, and if they brought new technology with them, she would learn to speak that language too, because that was what humans did. They adapted and they learned and they survived. And sometimes they turned their enemies' greatest weapons against them. The galaxy would remember this day, and the Dominion would never forget the lesson they had learned. Some species cannot be conquered, some walls cannot be broken, and some doors once opened can never be closed again. Humanity had announced its presence to the universe, and the universe would never be the same.